In the early 2000s, Takata was a relatively unknown corporation. They were best known for their manufacturing of airbags and safety seatbelts. However, some of you may know them from their sponsoring of Japanese race cars that raced in the All Japan JGTC Championship. Some of those cars even appearing in very famous racing games such as Gran Turismo and Forza. But what most people didn't know is that the biggest scandal in automotive history was brewing since the moment they started selling and manufacturing airbags in the early 1990s. In 2013, Takata was involved in one of the largest and most complex recalls in automotive history. Owners of more than 70 million vehicles received letters informing them of a potentially lethal defect in their car. An airbag, which was filled with shrapnel unknown to the driver, was ready to detonate at the moment of even a minor collision, turning what could have been a survivable impact into a horrific tragedy. So let's dive into how Takata went from being one of the most trusted automotive safety suppliers to a now shunned and scandalous corporation. To understand the whole story, we have to start at the beginning in 1933 when the founder Takazo Takata left his hometown of Kagawa, Japan to form his own company, Takata Corporation. The company began in the textile industry producing lifelines for parachutes. But it wasn't until the 1950s when the company began to research and develop seatbelts and other automotive safety technology. They formed Japan's first crash test plant where they could test their seatbelts in real-world situations. The 1960s was a huge decade for the automotive industry in Japan. Names like Honda, Toyota, and Nissan competed head-on domestically. Takata sold seatbelts to almost every big-name car manufacturer in Japan, bringing them to the forefront of Japanese automotive safety. By the late 1960s, Takata seatbelts were a standard option offered by most Japanese car manufacturers. That same decade also marked the year where the company began to research airbag technology, although not new at the time, it was not widely adopted in most vehicles. Takata was not the first company to research airbag systems. In fact, first airbag designs go as far back as the early 20th century, which used an air compressor generally set off by a switch in the front bumper. However, they did not inflate fast enough to be effective in real-world situations. Takata was not the first to make a breakthrough in airbag technology. That belongs to Japanese engineer whom I will call Mr. Kobori out of fear of butchering his first name. Kobori's design used a chemical explosive to inflate the airbag fast enough to be effective in a real-world collision. Kobori's design was thought to be responsible for today's widespread use of airbags, and in recognition of his great achievements, he was inducted into the Japanese Automotive Hall of Fame. General Motors was one of the first American manufacturers to offer these new type of airbags in 1974, although they were only available in select Chevy Impalas. The airbag was marketed as a replacement for seatbelt, as the percentage of drivers that actually wore a seatbelt in the 70s was rather low. Throughout the 70s and 80s, airbags became more and more of a common feature in cars, although this was met with some resistance from Ford and GM. Despite GM being one of the first to offer the technology, they called it infeasible and inappropriate. By the late 1980s, Takata had grown significantly as a company and expanded its operations to North America and Korea, selling its newly developed airbags to those markets. All was well with Takata until the 1990s when they would hit their first big road bump. Though this road bump did not involve airbags, it involved seatbelts manufactured by Takata. In May of 1995, a recall of more than 8 million, mostly Japanese vehicles was issued. Reports of seatbelts failing to latching and releasing automatically, or releasing during an accident flooded the NHTSA's mailbox, requiring them to launch an investigation into the issues with Takata's seatbelts. The issue they found was with the type of ABS plastic Takata was using, which degraded due to sunlight over time, causing them to become unstable and brittle. The manufacturers of the vehicles agreed to this voluntary recall, however, it did not go smoothly. 2 years after the recall was issued, only 18% of the affected 8 million vehicles were repaired. The NHTSA fined Takata and Honda a measly $50,000 civil penalty for not reporting the issue to the agency in a timely manner. The NHTSA wrote in their report they believe both Takata and Honda were aware of these failures, but attempted to cover up the early reports they had received. The emergence of airbags contributed to a sizable decline in the number of deaths and serious injuries on the roads of Europe and America. By the late 2000s, Takata held 20% of the world's airbag market, and airbags were a common feature of most mainstream cars. However, a sinister business tactic was brewing at the corporate headquarters of Takata. But first, I want to explain briefly how airbags work. Airbags are typically activated via sensors throughout the vehicle. The sensors detect rapid deceleration or collision forces, which sends a signal to a control unit, and that control unit determines whether an airbag deployment is necessary based on the severity of the impact. It then triggers an inflator module, which is the device that rapidly inflates the airbag cushion. The inflator module, typically encased in a metal housing, contains a chemical propellant and an igniter that is responsible for rapidly inflating the bag itself with nitrogen gas. In the early 1990s, Takata's airbag system used a chemical propellant known as tetrazole. Tetrazole is a stable and reliable compound that is less sensitive to environmental factors like heat and humidity. On top of that, it burns in a controlled manner, producing the nitrogen gas without a risk of overpressurizing. However, the reliability of tetrazole came at a cost, which was that it is generally more expensive than other propellants, and it required more of the compound to achieve the same effect. With profits in mind, Takata opted to search for a cheaper alternative to tetrazole, and not long later, Takata had found a much cheaper alternative. The chemical compound known as ammonium nitrate. It was much cheaper to source than tetrazole and required less of the compound to be as effective. But of course, that came at a price. Ammonium nitrate is significantly more prone to environmental factors like heat and humidity. And considering most of Takata's inflator modules lacked a drying agent, this meant that the ammonium nitrate is prone to absorbing moisture, leading to its degradation over time. Degraded ammonium nitrate becomes destabilized, leading to an unpredictable combustion. Combine this with the fact that the cars are expected to function in all types of climates, disaster was inevitable. And the engineers at Takata were very aware of this risk. However, pressure from corporate forced them to develop an inflator system that used ammonium nitrate. While the exact amount of money Takata saved by switching to ammonium nitrate is not known, it's estimated that it saved them a few dollars on each inflator unit. The company produced tens of millions of inflator units annually, so a few dollars on each inflator means that they are saving hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. By 2001, all of the airbags Takata sold used the chemical ammonium nitrate. Fast forward only a few years later, and you can imagine this storm would begin to unfold, albeit slowly, but it would begin. In 2004, Takata would become aware of a rather unique injury following a relatively minor accident in a 2002 Honda Accord. The driver suffered several deep cuts to their face, and there were no windows that had shattered. As such, Takata and Honda investigated the incident internally. What they found was that the propellant canister, including its metal housing, had completely exploded, sending metal shrapnel into the driver's face. Following this, similar incidents began to occur in other Honda Accords of the 2001 to 2002 model year. However, the companies wrote these events off as anomalies, and they jointly decided to not report these incidents to the appropriate government bodies. As the years went by, more and more reports of serious injuries occurred from minor accidents. Honda investigated the function of airbags on various models in their lineup, though eventually wrote these issues off as a manufacturer defect. And by 2008, the concerns were roaring, and Honda realized that they could not keep hiding from the issue. The NHTSA issued a small recall involving around 4,000 Honda Accords from the model years 2001 to 2002. citing that a defect exists within the airbag inflator modules. The recalls entitled owners of affected vehicles to a replacement airbag free of charge. However, as Honda continued to investigate and receive reports of overpressurized inflator units, what seemed like a relatively minor issue took a tragic turn in 2009 when the first death of an 18-year-old student occurred after a minor accident in a parking lot, sending metal shrapnel across her face and neck, resulting in her death. However, there was no liability involved with Honda and Takata as the case was settled outside of court. And as a result, the recall from 2008 was expanded to include the 2001 to 2002 Honda Civics, Accords, and Acura TLs. This recall encompassed more than 400,000 cars. The years following, reports of injuries kept rising, and the second official death was reported in 2010, while driving a 2001 Honda Accord. Eventually, more than 2.5 million cars entered the recall, and in 2013, the recalls would expand beyond Honda. More than 3.5 million Toyota, Nissan, Mazda, and BMWs were recalled due to potentially defective Takata airbags. During that same year, the NHTSA called Takata in for a meeting to discuss the extent of the defect. And it was reported by the NHTSA that Takata had produced testing reports that were falsified or purposely incomplete in several instances. Additionally, Takata failed to provide notice of the defect within a 5-day period as per the Safety and Regulations Protocol outlined by the Department of Transportation. Takata's avoidance to the situation would not go unnoticed as the recall grew larger. And in March of 2013 alone, the recalls would cost the company more than $300 million. However, at the time, recalls were only being issued in humid regions around the world, thus more likely to affect the ammonium nitrate propellant. Takata officially began to blame their subsidiary TK Holdings, claiming that they had improperly stored the chemicals used in airbags at their Mexican plant in Coahuila, Mexico. Additionally, TK Holdings did not keep proper quality control records at this plant, making it more difficult to identify vehicles with defective airbags. In 2014, 7 different automakers announced they were recalling more than 3 million vehicles worldwide due to Takata-made airbags. With some of these manufacturers issuing statements for owners to not drive their car at all, and instead having it towed to the dealership for service. Month after month, what seemed like millions of cars were added to the recall. By May of 2015, Takata officially became responsible for the largest recall in automotive history, encompassing more than 40 million vehicles.
Today, I announce that Takata has agreed to declare that airbag inflators are defective. It is recalling these inflators, and these recalls are nationwide. Let me repeat that. Takata has agreed to declare that their airbag inflators are defective.
So as far as we know, this is the largest recall in auto history. Others are doing research and suggest it could be one of the largest, if not the largest, in all of consumer recalls.
But as we know, this recall still affects cars to this day, and it's thought that more than 70 million vehicles have been recalled, encompassing more than 100 million airbags worldwide. A couple years later, in 2017, the US Department of Justice began to look into the criminal wrongdoing of Takata. Something they have a jumpstart on because of that meeting that took place between Takata and NHTSA in 2013, where they were called out for lying and falsifying data. The accusations go as follows. Takata was aware that a certain amount of airbag inflators had sustained failures during testing. Despite this knowledge, they induced its customers to purchase the airbag systems anyways. They did this by submitting false and fraudulent reports that concealed the truth of the inflators, making the performance of said airbags appear better than it actually was. Additionally, whistleblowers revealed that Takata executives routinely discussed the falsification of these reports that were provided to Takata customers. However, the only accusation that Takata pled guilty to was wire fraud. Eventually, in 2018, a settlement was reached that ordered Takata to pay $1 billion. During these investigations, Takata had filed for bankruptcy in the United States, and the remaining assets were sold off to Key Safety Systems, another automotive safety manufacturer. Despite the total collapse of Takata, this recall is still happening. Some of the affected vehicles driving around with deadly airbags to this day. And by 2025, A total of 28 deaths have been confirmed by the NHTSA in the United States alone, with another 7 deaths confirmed globally. I'll leave a link to the cars that have been affected by this recall in the description so that you can check to see if your car or a car you plan to buy needs to be repaired. Let me know what you guys think of Takata and this whole situation. Make sure to leave a comment as I read all the comments on my videos, so thanks for watching.